The aroma of baking dough and rich tomato sauce used to feel like home to David Walker. It was the kind of scent that welcomed him like an old friend each morning as he unlocked the doors to Walker's Brick Oven Pizza, a place he built with his own two hands nearly 2 decades ago. This restaurant wasn't just a business, it was his family's legacy. He still remembered the nights he spent perfecting the sauce in his garage, long before there was a storefront. But now, standing across the street with a crumpled receipt in one hand and doubt twisting in his chest, that same familiar smell churned his stomach. Something was wrong. Not just in the numbers, though those had been screaming for attention. Sales down 42% in 3 months, online reviews growing increasingly bitter, but in his gut. And David had learned over the years that when something felt off, it usually was. He didn't want to believe it at first. Maybe it was the economy, maybe local construction was driving traffic elsewhere, but when long-time regulars stopped showing up without a word, like the Palmers, who had celebrated every birthday here for 7 straight years, or when the high school soccer team, once loyal as clockwork, started tagging a national chain on Instagram instead, David could no longer ignore the signs. He had tried everything: new menu items, limited-time promotions, even adding online ordering with delivery tracking. Still, nothing changed. So he decided to do something drastic, something he hadn't done since his early days behind the counter. He would go undercover. That Thursday morning, David borrowed clothes from his son's closet, a stretched-out hoodie with a local skate shop logo, faded black jeans that didn't quite fit, and a Boston Red Sox cap his staff would never associate with him. Normally clean-cut, he let his facial stubble grow in, just enough to shadow his jawline. With a slightly hunched posture and a slower gait, he looked less like the meticulous owner and more like a middle-aged dad trying too hard to fit in. It was a calculated move. If he walked in as himself, every employee would straighten up, smile wider, and fake their way through the shift. But he wasn't looking for a show. He was looking for the truth. The kind of truth that hides in plain sight when no one thinks the boss is watching. As he crossed the street and approached the front door, David caught his reflection in the glass and barely recognized the man staring back. That wasn't the David Walker who'd been featured in the local paper, the entrepreneur who'd once won Best Neighborhood Eatery 5 years in a row. This version of him was anonymous, and that's exactly what he needed to be. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and instantly his heart sank. The music was too loud, mismatched with the slow vibe of the mid-morning lull. The front counter was unattended. Crumbs littered the floor near the soda station. None of these things would have happened under his watch. A young man finally appeared behind the counter, slouched, eyes glued to his phone, gums snapping between his teeth. "Yeah, you ordering something?" he mumbled, not even making eye contact. David mumbled back, using a slightly higher pitch and a casual tone. "Yeah, just a pepperoni slice and a Coke." The cashier barely reacted, scribbling something on a notepad instead of using the POS system David had upgraded just last year. The receipt he handed over was different too. Cheap, thin, and clearly not from the thermal printer David had installed. Every detail screamed something was wrong, but David kept his cool. He took a seat near the window, eyes scanning the restaurant as he pretended to scroll through his phone. The energy felt off. Staff moved with no urgency, no pride. Customers sat at tables with cold expressions, and not one person behind the counter looked like they cared. Then it clicked. The soul of the place was gone. This wasn't just about missing money or negative Yelp reviews. Something deeper had taken root. Complacency, disrespect, or worse, intentional sabotage. And the most unsettling part? His employees were too comfortable, too relaxed in the absence of real leadership. They weren't afraid of being held accountable anymore. And as David sat silently chewing on a slice of pizza that tasted like defeat, he realized he wasn't just there to observe. He was about to uncover something far bigger than bad service. He was stepping into a story he didn't expect, a story that would change the future of Walker's Brick Oven Pizza forever. The first red flag came wrapped in a lukewarm paper plate. David stared down at the slice of pepperoni pizza that had just been delivered to his table. Cheese stiff and congealed, the crust rubbery and pale, and steam conspicuously absent. He knew every step of the cooking process like the back of his hand. The dough was supposed to proof for 72 hours in a temperature-controlled room. The sauce was a closely guarded family recipe passed down from his grandfather, thick with herbs and just the right kick of sweetness. The cheese blend, custom ordered from a Wisconsin dairy farm, aged to perfection and shredded daily on site. But the slice in front of him tasted like it had been reheated in a microwave and left under a heat lamp for too long. It wasn't just off, it was disrespectful. He forced himself to chew slowly, resisting the urge to spit it out. If he reacted, he might blow his cover too soon. Across the counter, the cashier named Josh leaned lazily against the soda machine, thumbing through his phone without even glancing up at the growing lunch line. David watched as Megan, the other cashier, greeted the next customer with a flat, "What can I get you?" scribbled the order down on a napkin and handed it to the kitchen without entering anything into the POS terminal. David nearly choked on his soda. That system alone had cost him thousands. A state-of-the-art point-of-sale platform designed to streamline inventory, track orders, and prevent theft. It was the digital nerve center of his business. Yet here it sat, untouched, collecting dust, while his staff took orders the way someone might run a bake sale. The notepad she used had greasy fingerprints, curled edges, and no timestamp. Worse still, David noticed the receipt paper used for his own order was not the thermal paper they'd stocked for years. It was thinner, cheaper, and clearly brought in from outside the system. He quietly moved to a different seat, one closer to the main register, and kept watching. Over the next 20 minutes, David observed at least a dozen transactions, none of which were logged into the digital register. Customers paid cash. No receipts were offered. Tips were casually stuffed into an old cookie jar labeled Good Vibes Fund. The few who paid with a card were handed inconsistent totals, and the machine was an old backup terminal. One David had retired months ago for security reasons. The implication was chilling. If none of these transactions were being recorded, where was the money going? And why hadn't the discrepancies shown up more clearly in his financial reports? The answer, he realized, was simple. He'd been looking at data that wasn't capturing reality. Josh and Megan were running a shadow version of the restaurant, one that lived entirely off the books. David's stomach tightened, not from the food, but from the implications. Every slice that came out of the oven looked rushed, undercooked, or carelessly topped. He watched a small family send back their garlic knots, claiming they were cold inside. A young man at the next table unwrapped his calzone and shook his head in disappointment. "Used to be the best pizza in town," he muttered. "Now it's just..." A construction worker walked in and asked if today's lunch special included the meat lovers combo. Megan blinked at him and shrugged. "We don't really have those anymore," as if she had no idea what the menu even was. David's heart sank further. These weren't occasional mistakes. This was systematic decay, and his own staff was sleepwalking through it, or worse, orchestrating it. The final straw came when an older couple shuffled in, looking familiar. Then he realized it was the Hendersons, who had dined at the pizzeria every Sunday for 10 years. They walked to the counter, looked at the menu board, then whispered to each other and quietly walked out. No greeting, no recognition, no reason to stay. David wanted to chase after them, to ask what had changed, to promise that the real Walker's brick oven pizza still existed. But he stayed seated, his disguise keeping him chained to the role of silent observer. That kind of moment, the quiet exit of a loyal customer, spoke louder than any review ever could. It told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about poor performance. This was betrayal. As he sipped his now flat cola, David tried to control his breathing, his hands clenched beneath the table, heart pounding behind a calm exterior. This restaurant had survived recessions, changing food trends, and even a kitchen fire in 2012. But what he was seeing now wasn't a challenge from outside. It was sabotage from within. Something had taken root in the heart of his business, and it was rotting everything from the inside out. He didn't know the full scope yet, but he knew enough to be afraid. Still, beneath the shock and frustration, something else began to stir, a flicker of resolve, because now he wasn't just an owner trying to save a business. He was a father, a steward of legacy, and a man with something to fight for. And if Josh, Megan, or anyone else thought this story would end quietly, they were about to be proven very, very wrong. Just as David was beginning to process the bitter reality of what his restaurant had become, the front door swung open with a sharp chime. In stepped a young woman holding a half-open pizza box and a toddler balanced on one hip. Her face was flushed, not from the summer heat, but from something far more volatile, anger held back by sheer necessity. Her eyes scanned the room, bypassing the few customers and landing squarely on the counter where Josh and Megan stood chatting idly. David straightened in his seat instinctively, sensing a storm about to hit. The woman marched forward and placed the box firmly on the counter. "This is the third time this week," she said, her voice quivering just enough to reveal how close she was to boiling over. "I ordered a plain cheese pizza for my son's birthday party, and instead, I got this. Jalapenos, hot sauce, and sausage." Josh blinked. Megan blinked. Then, without missing a beat, Megan slipped into customer service mode, voice syrupy and smooth. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We've been having issues with our delivery system lately. I can offer you a refund or a remake." The woman didn't budge. "I don't want a refund. I want someone to actually pay attention to the orders. Do you know what it's like to have a room full of 6-year-olds crying because their mouths are on fire?" Megan's smile faltered, but only for a second. She turned to Josh, who shrugged and offered up the lie like it was nothing. "Our owner's been away, dealing with some personal stuff," he said with a practiced sigh, as if the weight of running a business had fallen squarely on their young, unsuspecting shoulders. "He hasn't really been around to handle things." David felt the words hit his chest like a punch. Away? He'd been in his office every day for the last 2 months, poring over spreadsheets, checking purchase orders, reviewing vendor contracts, and trying to uncover why everything was falling apart. Away? He hadn't taken a day off since his wedding anniversary, and even then, he'd checked the night shift reports. And now these two, standing behind the counter of his life's work, were feeding lies to paying customers as casually as if they were announcing the daily special. The mother, still angry but clearly too tired to argue further, took the refund Megan offered and turned on her heel, mumbling something about never coming back again. As she walked out, David caught the flash of tears she wiped away with the back of her hand. Her son clutched a juice box and looked confused, as if wondering what he did wrong. But it wasn't the mother's disappointment that stunned David the most. It was what happened next. As the door closed behind her, Megan leaned over toward Josh and, in the lull between orders, whispered with a smirk, "It's almost too easy." Josh chuckled. He still thinks people just don't like his pizza anymore. David's breath caught mid-inhale, the condescension in her tone, the smugness in his response. It wasn't just careless behavior, it was calculated. They weren't just bad employees, they were orchestrating something. David reached slowly into his hoodie pocket and opened the voice recording app on his phone, setting it on the table with the microphone pointed toward the counter. The gravity of the moment settled over him like a thundercloud. This wasn't just incompetence, it was sabotage. And for the first time since walking in that morning, David realized he might not be dealing with a failing restaurant, but a betrayal from within. The pair continued chatting in hushed tones, unaware that their boss, disguised and silent, sat just a few feet away. "Did you see his face last week when he was checking the reports?" Megan snorted. "He looked like he was about to cry." Josh laughed, leaning on the counter like it was a joke they'd shared dozens of times. "I swear, he probably thinks we just need a new coupon flyer or something." David's fingers curled around his paper cup until it crinkled audibly. This place was supposed to be sacred. Built on his grandfather's recipes. On the years he spent working 16-hour days. On the family birthday parties, first dates, and graduation dinners held within these walls. And now, the people he'd hired to carry that legacy forward were mocking him behind his back, and blaming him for the very problems they were creating. He looked down at the cold slice in front of him, his name on the box, but someone else's disaster inside. He took a breath, steadying himself. He wasn't ready to confront them yet, not without evidence, not without a plan. But now the mission was clear. This wasn't just about rescuing a restaurant. It was about reclaiming his identity, his reputation, and the honor of the Walker family legacy. And if Josh and Megan thought they could lie their way into tearing it all down, they had no idea what was coming next. David's fingers twitched slightly on the edge of the table, hovering near his phone as it continued recording the conversation playing out only a few feet away. The post-lunch lull had settled over the dining room, and the chatter from customers had quieted enough for him to hear the low exchange between Josh and Megan more clearly. That's when he caught it. "It's almost too easy," Megan said again, her voice laced with the kind of arrogance that only came from someone who believed they'd already won. "He still thinks people just don't like his pizza anymore." David didn't move. Didn't blink. He was afraid that even the faintest reaction might alert them, but inside a storm was building. The sabotage wasn't just passive neglect. It was intentional, and these two weren't just lazy, they were orchestrating it. Then Josh leaned in slightly, his voice lower now, but David caught every word. "A couple more weeks of this and he'll fold. We've already got half the regulars eating across the street." Megan gave a sly smile, "and the other half are too polite to complain, they just stop coming." David felt his jaw tighten. He wanted to stand up and confront them both right then, demand an explanation, demand respect for everything he had built. But then Megan said something that made his stomach turn. "Did you add the drops to today's sauce batch?" Josh reached into his pocket and casually patted it. "Right here." Dylan said it only takes a few drops to kill the flavor. No one will notice. It's not dangerous, it just makes everything taste off. Cardboard, basically. Megan grinned. "Perfect. Let them think the family recipe lost its magic." David's world tilted slightly. Sauce modifier? Dylan? What were they talking about? The sauce was the heartbeat of the restaurant. His grandfather's original recipe, unchanged for 3 generations. David had never written it down in full, never trusted it to a database or a shared document. He'd memorized it like scripture. Every pinch of oregano, every twist of cracked pepper. Now, hearing that someone was deliberately tampering with it was more than betrayal. It was desecration. And Dylan, that name rang louder than the rest. Kyle Dylan. A name David hadn't heard in months, but hadn't forgotten. A former shift manager who had once shown promise, eager, smart, quick on the register, but also reckless, entitled. A man who'd crumbled under pressure and, when caught skimming cash, had exploded into a tirade about being undervalued and screwed by the system. David had fired him on the spot. He remembered the look on Kyle's face that day. Rage masked as self-righteousness, the kind of dangerous anger that didn't cool down with time. Apparently it hadn't. Now Kyle was back, not through the front door, but through the shadows, whispering orders to Josh and Megan, pulling strings from behind the curtain. And worst of all, it was working. David hadn't connected the dots at first, hadn't seen the way the flavor had dulled, how the online reviews shifted from glowing to disappointed. He thought maybe the cheese distributor had changed batches, maybe the tomato supply had dipped in quality, but it hadn't. It was sabotage. Calculated, cold, and likely part of something much bigger than just 2 disgruntled cashiers and a bitter ex-employee. As David sat still, rage battled strategy in his mind. He had the start of a smoking gun, a recorded confession, subtle as it was, but he needed more. If Kyle was the puppet master, what was his endgame? And who else might be involved? Sabotaging the food was one thing, but the coordinated use of old receipt paper, handwritten orders, and misused equipment pointed to a larger scheme, one that might not stop at simply ruining the restaurant's reputation. They were trying to collapse it from within, to bring it to its knees so David would sell, surrender, or fail. But why? Revenge? Money? Or something else entirely? He pushed his plate away, the cold slice now forgotten. Every bite he'd taken that day had been poisoned, not just with a chemical modifier, but with betrayal. His customers, families, students, retirees had unknowingly been served food that was deliberately stripped of its soul, and behind the counter, the people he had paid, trained, and trusted were laughing about it. But David Walker wasn't going to crumble. Not this time. He quietly stood, adjusted his hoodie, and walked out of the dining room with the calm of a man who had just found his enemy. Kyle thought he was clever, hiding behind pawns like Josh and Megan. But David had built this restaurant from scratch. He had survived things far worse than a bitter ex-employee with a vendetta. And now he had a mission. The clock had started ticking, and David intended to turn the game on its head. David didn't return to his office that afternoon. Instead, he parked himself just outside the building in his car, replaying the audio he had captured and jotting down every key phrase. What he'd heard so far had already crossed lines. Tampering with food quality, lying to customers, and whispering orders from a disgruntled former employee. But David's instincts told him there was more. Something bigger, something dirtier. So he waited, knowing the quiet between the lunch and dinner rush would loosen lips. Just after 3 o'clock, Megan stepped outside to take a smoke break, and Josh followed. David cracked his window just enough to catch the conversation. What he heard next chilled him to the bone. "So, Kyle says Phase 2 starts next week," Megan muttered, flicking ash onto the pavement. "The inspector's gonna drop by. And let's just say, he won't be impressed by the state of the freezer." Josh laughed. "Man, Kyle's a genius. I mean, who'd have thought we'd be bribing health inspectors?" He pulled out his phone, flipping through something. "This guy owes Kyle's cousin a favor or something. Gambling debts, I think. He's agreed to cite us for 5 major violations: fake mold, cross-contamination, improper food storage, all staged, of course." Megan smirked. "And once that report hits the public record, it'll spread like wildfire. Yelp, Reddit, Google. Nobody eats at a place with a D rating." David's grip on the steering wheel turned his knuckles white. Bribing a government official? Staging violations? That wasn't just sabotage, that was criminal conspiracy. It wasn't just about damaging his business anymore. This was about destroying it. Permanently. And from what he was hearing, Kyle wasn't acting out of pettiness. He had a plan, layered and deliberate. Slowly choke the restaurant's reputation, poison the food, alienate the regulars, and then hit it with a fatal blow through a health inspection scandal. And all the while, David's name and brand would be dragged through the mud, branded as the negligent owner who let his standards collapse. Then came the final reveal. "You think Kyle's guy is still down to buy the place?" Josh asked. "Definitely," Megan said. "He's been waiting for this. Some franchise developer from Denver. They already drew up plans for a new frozen yogurt chain or something. As soon as this place tanks, Kyle gets his finder's fee, and we get our bonuses." David's stomach turned. It wasn't just a vendetta anymore. It was a real estate scheme. Kyle wasn't trying to punish David for firing him. He was clearing the way for someone else to swoop in, buy the land cheap, and build a sanitized, soulless chain on top of his family's legacy. It was a hostile takeover in disguise, with Kyle as the inside man and Josh and Megan as the executioners. And what made it worse? They were winning. The complaints, the refunds, the falling ratings. Every step had been engineered to push David toward desperation, to get him to either sell the business or abandon it in shame. Kyle had been working angles David hadn't even considered. Co-opting staff, faking inspection failures, faking citations. And the public would never know the difference. They'd just stop coming. No one wants to eat at a place with headlines about rats in the freezer, or expired meat, or a failing grade on the health board's door, even if none of it was true. But Kyle had made one fatal miscalculation. He'd underestimated David Walker. He assumed the owner would retreat quietly, too proud to go public, too sentimental to fight back. But David wasn't just sentimental, he was strategic. He had run this restaurant through economic recessions, equipment failures, staff walkouts, and supply shortages. He had built it from scratch, with his hands and his name on every recipe. And now, with this new information in hand, he wasn't going to crumble. He was going to prepare, gather proof, rally allies. And when the time was right, he'd shine a spotlight on every roach in the dark corner of this plot, including Kyle. Just as the weight of everything threatened to crush David, the front door chimed with a soft ding, barely noticeable over the low hum of the kitchen's exhaust fans. But for David, the sound was unmistakable. It carried with it the faintest thread of hope. He looked up from his table near the corner, and there she was, Lauren Kim, his head chef of nearly 11 years. She wasn't in uniform today, just a grey hoodie, dark jeans, and a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder. But her presence still carried that same quiet authority that had once kept his entire kitchen in harmony. Her expression shifted the moment she stepped inside. She didn't smile. She scanned the room with a chef's instinct, sensing the tension in the air like the scent of a burnt crust. Her eyes briefly met David's, and something flickered. Recognition, maybe not of him, in disguise, but of the unease that clung to the walls of the restaurant like grease. Lauren approached the counter calmly, but before she could step behind it, before she could even glance toward the kitchen, Megan intercepted her. "Hey! You're not scheduled today," Megan said, tone casual but eyes sharp. "Health inspector's due any minute, so we're keeping the kitchen clear." She blocked Lauren's path, subtly moving to stand between her and the swinging doors. Lauren raised an eyebrow. "Since when do we keep our own chef out of our own kitchen?" Megan shrugged, reaching for the sanitizer bottle. "New policy, Kyle's orders. We're just being extra cautious. You know how they are with pop inspections." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. She'd worked in this industry long enough to recognize a lie, especially one delivered with a sugar-coated edge. David watched from his seat, heart pounding. He knew Lauren well. Knew she was perceptive, knew she wouldn't push right away. And true to form, Lauren didn't argue. She just nodded, eyes calm, and said, "All right, just dropped by to grab my spice kit anyway. I left it in the pantry last week." Megan hesitated, clearly unsure whether to allow it. "We'll grab it for you," she said too quickly. "Don't want to risk contamination." Lauren blinked slowly. "Okay. I'll wait out here." She stepped aside and pulled out her phone as casually as if she were checking messages, then walked slowly to a quiet table by the window. Megan disappeared into the back, and David could see her moving fast, too fast, probably texting Kyle or Josh. Lauren didn't touch her drink. Instead, she set her tote bag on the table and slid her phone into the front pocket of her hoodie. Her hand lingered there. David knew that look. Lauren was no ordinary chef. She had a military father and a journalism major sister. She believed in facts, structure, and exposure. The calm, unreadable expression she wore was the same one she had during the winter flood 2 years ago, when she'd helped coordinate volunteers without raising her voice once. And now, beneath her hoodie, David suspected she was recording. Maybe audio, maybe more. Lauren glanced toward the kitchen again. Her gaze lingered just long enough for David to realize she wasn't just being cautious. She was watching for patterns. For who moved where, for what wasn't being said. Then she stood up. "Tell Kyle he can call me if he wants to change policies without informing his chef," she told Megan, as the young woman returned from the kitchen, handing over a small box of spices. "I'll be back tomorrow." Lauren left without another word, but David's heart was suddenly racing with something he hadn't felt in days. Confidence. Because if anyone could sense that something was wrong and do something about it, it was Lauren Kim. She wasn't just a chef. She was the foundation of the restaurant's soul, and she'd clearly seen through the act. As she passed the window, David caught a glimpse of her hand slipping into her coat pocket, pulling out what looked like a small flash drive. She connected it to her phone and tapped the screen with practiced ease. Then she made a call. Her lips didn't move much, but he saw the shape of a name. Carter. Her old friend at the local press. David looked down at his phone. It was still recording, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Somewhere out there, help was moving into place. Lauren would never walk away without a plan. She'd seen enough to know this wasn't just kitchen sloppiness or a temporary morale issue. This was coordinated, deliberate sabotage. And now, with Lauren on the outside watching and David on the inside gathering proof, the pieces of the counterstrike were falling into place. If Kyle thought his network was airtight, he'd overlooked one key detail. True loyalty can't be bought, and tradition doesn't crumble in silence. David closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "Game on." Lauren didn't go straight home. Instead, she looped around the back alley behind Walker's brick oven pizza, her boots crunching softly against gravel, eyes scanning for any sign she'd been followed. A few minutes later, a nondescript black SUV pulled up beside her. The window rolled down and there was David, no longer in disguise but still wearing the exhaustion of the day across his face. "Get in," he said. She did. Inside, the air was still. The only sound was the soft click of the doors locking. Lauren didn't waste time. From her tote bag, she pulled out a well-worn folder, thick with printed documents, USB drives, and a notepad filled with scribbled times, names, and suspicious transactions. "I've been watching them for weeks," she said, her voice low and steady. "At first, I thought it was just disorganization. Then, I started seeing patterns." David took the folder and flipped it open. The first page was a vendor invoice, one he didn't recognize. "You didn't authorize this supplier," Lauren continued. "Neither did I. Megan changed the cheese order 2 months ago. I caught it when the sauce started separating differently in the oven. I've been tracking every deviation since." She pulled up her phone and opened a spreadsheet. Rows upon rows of entries showing mismatched inventory deliveries, timestamps for unauthorized shifts, changes to cleaning supply vendors, and even photos of backdoor cash exchanges. "They've been sloppy," Lauren added, "but not stupid. They're covering their tracks just well enough to make it look like mismanagement. That's why I started digging deeper." David shook his head, still trying to process the sheer scope of it all. "They're not doing this alone," he said quietly. Lauren nodded and reached into the file again, this time pulling out a printed email chain. The sender was someone named Kyle D. The recipient? A contact at Clearway Holdings. "It's a shell developer," Lauren explained. "They specialize in flipping neighborhoods. Buy up properties under market value, push out the small businesses, and replace them with high-margin chains. Their name doesn't show up directly on anything, but Clearway's behind the property buys all along this block. Yours is the only one they haven't locked down." David leaned back in his seat, feeling the weight of the revelation crash into him like a freight train. So it wasn't just Kyle, or even a couple of bitter employees. It was a coordinated corporate operation, and he was standing in the way of a multi-million-dollar redevelopment plan. "They sent Kyle in after I refused to sell last fall," David realized aloud. "That real estate agent. They said a client wanted to put in a coffee chain. I told them this place wasn't for sale." Lauren's jaw tightened. That's when they planted Kyle. He got hired with a fake resume and forged references. I dug into it. None of his old workplaces exist. They were all shell businesses. This whole thing was planned from the start. The SUV was silent for a long beat. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows against the alley walls. Inside, David stared at the folder in his lap, seeing his past, present, and future spelled out in black ink and betrayal. "They want to erase this place," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Turn it into another fast casual chain. Take away the only place in this neighborhood where people feel like they matter." Lauren looked over, her expression softening. "Not if we stop them. I've already contacted a journalist friend. He's interested. But we need more. Financials, recordings, a clear link between Kyle and the development firm. We take this to the media and the law at the same time." David turned to her slowly. "You're really in this?" She held his gaze. "David, this place is more than a paycheck. You taught me how to make real sauce. You trusted me when I'd just lost my last job and didn't believe in myself anymore. I'm not letting them burn this place to the ground." He exhaled, the first breath in days that felt like it carried purpose. "All right," he said, voice resolute. Then let's give them something they won't see coming. Outside the car, the neighborhood slept under a false calm. But inside, a fire was building, one lit not by revenge, but by the unwavering determination to protect something worth saving. Together, David and Lauren were done being targets. Now, they were about to fight back. The more David studied the documents in Lauren's folder, the clearer it became that Kyle wasn't the architect. He was the pawn. A dangerous pawn, yes, with just enough ego and anger to carry out someone else's agenda with ruthless efficiency. But he was being played too. One particular email string caught David's attention. Communications between Kyle and someone using the alias M. Wexler. The emails were coded in corporate speak, but the subtext was unmistakable. Carry out the plan, destabilize the business, secure the property. In one exchange, Wexler casually reminded Kyle, "The paperwork will be transferred after the transaction is complete. Just stay the course. Don't overthink the cleanup." David's pulse quickened. It was a setup. Once Kyle delivered the collapse of Walker's brick oven pizza, he'd be discarded. The blame would be pinned on him, and Clearway Holdings would walk away with a valuable property and clean hands. Later that evening, Lauren brought in backup, her older brother Kevin Kim, a corporate attorney with a sharp suit and a sharper sense of pattern recognition. They met in the back office of a closed bookstore a few blocks away from prying eyes and ears. Kevin reviewed the documents Lauren had gathered, and within 10 minutes he was shaking his head. "I've seen this exact strategy before," he said grimly. "Out-of-state developers use shell companies to buy up real estate, especially legacy-owned family businesses. They drive down the value through bad press, sabotage, and manipulation. They either plant someone inside or turn a disgruntled employee into a battering ram, and once the owner's desperate enough, they swoop in with a lowball offer and a mountain of fake paperwork showing declining worth." He laid out a flowchart of how the deals were structured. Kyle, it turned out, was one of many like him across the country. Kevin flipped through another folder, revealing a list of local review sites and the IP addresses used to post negative reviews about Walkers over the past 6 weeks. Nearly all of them originated from a central node in Sacramento, Clearway Holdings state headquarters. "They're running review farms," Kevin explained. "Anonymous accounts, posting in waves, tanking reputations before big inspections. They did the same thing to a sushi place in Denver, to a diner in Tacoma. I represented one of them, too late unfortunately. The owner sold in a panic. The new developer tore it down within a month." David sat in stunned silence, watching everything he loved laid out like a formula. What he thought was a personal vendetta had, in fact, been a long-played hand by a faceless giant that specialized in killing small businesses for profit. Lauren's voice broke the silence. "We have proof, David. Clearway is behind all of it. And if Kyle thinks he's getting a slice of the pie, he's sorely mistaken. They're setting him up as the fall guy." She showed him a forged lease agreement filed with the county clerk's office, already time-stamped for the upcoming month, signed by Kyle on behalf of Walker's Brick Oven Pizza as acting manager. "This gives them legal cover," Kevin said. "They'll use this to say he acted independently. Then they'll press charges if he speaks up. Classic corporate betrayal. Make your agent do the dirty work, then blame them when the light comes on." David's fists clenched. Kyle had betrayed him, yes, but now even he was a tool, being prepped for disposal. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Not just fake reviews and health code sabotage, but altered invoices, forged vendor agreements, even forged health inspection photos. Kevin's team had run a reverse image search and found that some of the evidence Clearway planned to submit against Walkers, like images of moldy floors and expired meats, had been lifted from unrelated restaurants in different states. "This isn't just fraud," Kevin said. "This is organized crime with a corporate twist. They're using every legal gray area they can find and forging the rest. But if we time it right, we can catch them mid-move." David's head swam with 100 thoughts, but his gut had already settled on one. We fight. This wasn't just about saving his family's name anymore. it was about protecting every honest business owner who could be next. For the first time in weeks, David felt something new spark in his chest. Not just hope, but fire. With Kevin's legal brain, Lauren's evidence, and David's personal insight into the business's every corner, they now had the upper hand. "We hit them on every front," Lauren said. "Expose the review farms to the press. Get the forged lease in front of the DA. Send the vendor fraud to the state licensing board. And once we have Kyle on the record, we flip him," Kevin finished. "He's the weak link. We give him the truth, show him they're planning to frame him, and get him to talk before they silence him. Once he sees the paperwork and understands what's really happening, he'll crack." David nodded slowly. Then it settled. They wanted to tear this place down. Instead, we'll use it as the stage where everything comes crashing down on them. And with that, Operation Counterpunch had begun. David sat in the quiet of his office long after the restaurant had closed, the lights dimmed, the streets outside silent except for the occasional passing car. On the desk in front of him lay every file Lauren and Kevin had collected, documents, recordings, photos, contracts. A storm was coming, but this time it was one he intended to direct. With a deep breath, David picked up the burner phone Kevin had given him, dialed the number, and waited. 3 rings, then a voice. "Agent Trina Ross, Organized Crime Division." David didn't hesitate. "My name is David Walker. I own Walker's Brick Oven Pizza. I have evidence of a coordinated corporate sabotage effort tied to Clearway Holdings. I believe it links to racketeering, and I think your office might already be looking into it." There was a pause, then a soft click. The call went encrypted. "Mr. Walker," the voice said again, now with sharp intent. "Tell me everything." By the time David finished explaining, Agent Ross confirmed what he'd hoped and feared. "Clearway Holdings has been on our radar for months," she said. "Real estate manipulation, fraudulent redevelopment deals, witness intimidation. We've been building a RICO case, but it's been hard to nail down specifics. What you're describing, it's gold, but we need proof, a live admission, a paper trail, something indisputable." David looked toward the window, where his restaurant's familiar neon sign glowed with tired light. "You'll have it," he promised. And with that, he and Lauren began mapping out the counterattack. Lauren, calm and composed as ever, was already texting Kyle under the guise of growing frustration with David's so-called incompetence. "He thinks I'm cracking," she said, holding up her phone. "He's ready to bring me deeper in." David nodded. "Let him." That weekend, under the pretense of quitting, Lauren met Kyle at a bar 2 towns over. She wore a hidden mic, courtesy of the FBI, while David waited in a nearby vehicle, listening through an earpiece. Kyle, smug and careless, revealed more than he realized. He confirmed the bribe to the inspector, detailed his manipulation of Josh and Megan, and casually dropped names: Wexler, Clearway, a shell firm called Norquest Partners. "Once it's sold, I'm out," Kyle bragged. "They're going to make this place disappear, clean it up, franchise it, just another cookie-cutter pizza joint, baby, and guess who's getting a bonus for breaking it down?" Lauren played her part perfectly, laughing at his arrogance, nudging him to talk more. "They know you're running this?" she asked innocently. Kyle scoffed. "They don't care. Long as I deliver the collapse, they'll cover the trail. I'm golden." What Kyle didn't know was that David was already preparing a very public reckoning. With the FBI's blessing, David contacted several local journalists, one from the Tribune, another from a neighborhood podcast, and even a food critic who had originally panned Walker's during the sabotage phase. Each one received a personalized packet, evidence of review manipulation, doctored invoices, and the digital breadcrumbs connecting Clearway to Kyle and the entire operation. "We're not just taking them down in court," David told Agent Ross. "We're taking them down in the public square." Meanwhile, Kevin filed an injunction to freeze any pending property transactions tied to Walker's. With the FBI, press, and public now quietly watching, David took the final step, a formal meeting request with Clearway's regional rep, under the guise of finally considering the sale. They met in a corporate office overlooking the city, sterile, modern, and full of glass. Gerald Langford, Clearway's executive, smiled with that practiced warmth of someone used to closing deals with handshakes and lies. "Mr. Walker," he said, "we're glad you reconsidered. Let's discuss next steps." David sat calmly, a small recorder tucked inside his jacket, a folder in his hands. "Before we move forward," David said, sliding the folder across the table, "I want you to take a look at something." Langford's eyes scanned the contents. Copies of the fake reviews tied to Clearway's IP addresses, vendor fraud traced back to shell suppliers, the leaked emails from Kyle. "Where did you get this?" Langford's voice dropped. "Doesn't matter," David replied. "But you should know I've shared this with the press, the FBI, and my attorney. This isn't a negotiation anymore, it's a warning." Langford's mask cracked then, only for a second, but David caught it, the panic behind the eyes, the knowledge that the walls were closing in. "If anything happens to me or my staff," David continued, "this story goes national. If you make one more move on this property, we'll take you to court for fraud, RICO violations and harassment, and we'll win. Because unlike you, I built this place on real relationships, real loyalty, and real food. And you're about to find out what happens when you try to erase that with money and fraud." He stood, slow and deliberate. "This meeting is over." He didn't wait for a response. Outside the office, Lauren was waiting. She looked at him, calm and ready. "You think it worked?" she asked. David smiled for the first time in days. "No," he said, "I know it did. Now we just wait for the collapse." The bell above the front door of Walker's Brick Oven Pizza rang with a sharp clang, slicing through the soft buzz of lunchtime chatter. Customers turned, staff froze, and David, standing near the open kitchen, calmly placing basil leaves on a margarita pizza, already knew who had just arrived. Kyle. Red-eyed, furious, and shaking with barely restrained rage, he stormed through the dining area like a man on the edge of collapse. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at David. "You think you can set me up, make me the fool guy for your collapsing joke of a business?" The room went silent. A phone dropped somewhere near the counter. Lauren, already in place near the back wall, calmly nodded to Agent Ross and her team, seated in plainclothes at 3 different tables. David looked up, meeting Kyle's wild eyes with a calm that came from finally knowing the truth was on his side. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. Instead, he gently turned the wooden peel under the pizza, allowing the crust to crisp to perfection inside the open flame oven. "Kyle," he said, his voice level, "if I'm such a failure, why are you here? What exactly are you afraid of?" Kyle slammed a fist on the counter. "You stole my future. You tricked me with fake recipes. You planted those files." The last words came in a strained growl, loud enough that several phones lifted to start recording, exactly as planned. David nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth and stepping forward with the poise of a man who had weathered storms far worse than this. "You're right about one thing," he said. "The recipes you stole, they weren't real, not even close." Kyle froze, a flicker of doubt cutting through his fury. David pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his apron, a worn journal with frayed edges and delicate handwritten notes. "You ever wonder why your version of our signature sauce never tasted quite right?" he asked. "Why your copycat pies came out flat, even when you followed the ingredients to the letter?" He flipped open the book and held it up. "Because the real recipes, every last one, are written in my grandfather's native Greek, not English. What you stole were decoys, planted the day I caught you skimming from the register." Laughter rippled through the room, not mocking, but disbelieving. Lauren's eyes sparkled as she watched Kyle's face morph from fury to realization to dread. "You used me?" Kyle muttered. "You? You set me up?" David tilted his head. "No. You set yourself up the moment you decided betrayal was a shortcut to success." At that moment, Agent Ross rose from her seat and stepped forward, flanked by 2 officers. "Kyle Donovan," she said firmly, her badge flashing, "you are under investigation for conspiracy to commit corporate sabotage, wire fraud, tampering with food products, and participating in a racketeering operation with Clearway Holdings. You have the right to remain silent. Kyle backed away in disbelief. This is a joke. You can't do this, he's lying. But the phones were still recording. The room was still watching. And the FBI had more than just David's word. They had weeks of surveillance. They had Lauren's recordings. And now they had Kyle's public meltdown, captured live and unfiltered, broadcast in real time across every social platform in the city. David turned back to the oven and pulled out the margarita pizza, steam curling off the golden crust, the scent of crushed tomatoes and oregano filling the room. "Lunch is on the house today," he said warmly to the stunned patrons. "1 pie per table, made fresh, made right, made the way my grandfather taught me." And as he sliced that first pizza and plated it himself, the tension in the room melted. Customers clapped, phones went down, smiles returned. Because the food, real, honest, handmade, spoke louder than any press release or headline ever could. Lauren moved behind the counter to help, smiling softly as she passed a slice to a pair of regulars who hadn't dared return since the sabotage began. David looked out at his restaurant, not just saved, but reborn. Kyle was escorted out in cuffs. Clearway's plot was crumbling, and his reputation, his legacy, was now stronger than ever. But it wasn't just the victory that brought peace to his chest. It was the way it happened. Not through retaliation, not through anger, but through truth, through trust, through staying the course when the world told him to give up. And as he worked side by side with Lauren in that familiar kitchen, with the flames of the oven dancing behind him and the taste of real justice on the air, David knew that Walker's brick oven pizza hadn't just survived. It had risen. A month had passed since the firestorm ended, and yet the air around Walker's brick oven pizza felt lighter than ever. What once stood as a quiet, humble corner restaurant had now become something greater, a symbol of resilience, integrity, and the unwavering spirit of family-owned businesses. Reporters still occasionally dropped by, drawn to the story of how one man took on a corporate giant and won, not with lawyers and PR spins, but with heritage, honesty, and dough-proofed for 72 hours. The local paper called it the pizza that fought back. But for David Walker, none of it was about headlines. It was about something deeper. Something rooted in flour, fire, and the lessons his grandfather had whispered to him in Greek while stirring sauce by hand. It was about restoring what mattered most: purpose. Inside the restaurant, everything had changed, but nothing had. The wood-fire oven still glowed in the corner. The aroma of roasted garlic and basil still wrapped around customers like a warm embrace. But now, behind the counter stood new faces. Local teens, second-chance hires, and culinary hopefuls trained under Lauren's watchful eye. A small plaque above the register read, "Built on truth, baked with care." It was Lauren's idea, and David had to admit, it made the perfect promise to every person who walked through the door. Beyond the restaurant, though, something even bigger had taken root. Inspired by what he'd uncovered, David launched the Local Kitchen Defense Fund, a non-profit initiative built to support other family-run restaurants who found themselves in the crosshairs of corporate manipulation, predatory acquisitions, or online sabotage. The fund, backed by small donors and a surprising wave of community support, quickly gathered momentum. Within weeks, David and Kevin had already intervened in 3 cases across the state. One involving a barbecue joint in Kansas City, another a taco stand in Arizona. In each case, the story was eerily familiar. Fake reviews, sabotage supplies, shady offers from holding companies. But now, with the evidence and legal precedent from the Clearway takedown, David's team had teeth, and more importantly, a voice. "We're not just protecting recipes," David told a local business expo crowd. "We're protecting stories, bloodlines, tables where generations sit down to eat together. If corporations think they can erase that with a few zeros and a contract, they're in for a surprise." Back at the restaurant, David had a new apprentice. His teenage son, Noah, once more interested in video games than ovens, now showed up early every Saturday, apron tied, sleeves rolled up. At first, he'd just watched. Then, slowly, he started asking questions. Why do you mix the flour by hand? What's the difference between oregano and marjoram? Why do you write the recipes in Greek? One morning, David handed him the family journal, its pages smudged with olive oil and thyme. Because tradition isn't just meant to be followed, he said gently. It's meant to be understood. Noah flipped through the pages like they were sacred texts, eyes wide, finally seeing the legacy he stood to inherit. Not just of food, but of values. Customers noticed the change too. The boy with the backward cap, who used to skate by the counter, now greeted patrons with a confident smile. Try the house special, he'd say. It's made with the original recipe. And when people asked, Are you the owner's son? He didn't flinch. He nodded with pride. David watched him one day from across the kitchen, eyes damp. It was more than passing down a recipe. It was passing down resilience. And in that moment, he knew the mission was complete. Not because the battle was over, but because the next generation had picked up the spoon. On the restaurant's 25th anniversary, the line wrapped around the block again, just like in the early days. But this time, it wasn't because of a scandal or a promotion. It was because people believed in what Walkers stood for. David stood beside Lauren and Noah, handing out slices, shaking hands, laughing freely. And when someone from a local news crew asked what he thought of everything that had happened, he smiled. The oven's still burning, he said, and as long as it is, we'll keep baking truth into every pie. For David Walker, legacy wasn't something etched into a wall. It was something kneaded into dough, passed from calloused hand to curious heart, one generation at a time. If the story moved you, don't let it end here. At Deep Inside HQ, we believe in the power of stories to reveal truth, stir compassion, and spark change. Every video we share is crafted to reflect real-life challenges, quiet acts of bravery, and the kind of integrity the world desperately needs more of. If these stories resonate with you, if they make you think, feel, or see the world a little differently, then join our growing community. Hit that subscribe button, share the message, and be part of something deeper. Because the world doesn't just need entertainment, it needs meaning. And that's what we're here to deliver, one powerful story at a time.